Rogers, Anthony John Solano, Peter John Scazzolio, David John Scabrone, Dennis Richard Schmidt, Anthony Michael Schmutz, Charles Joseph Schlitz, William Arthur Schlitz, John William Schweier Jr., David Shields, William Short, Robert John Slattery, John David Smith, George Michael Smith, Toma Rankin Snett, Richard Cortland Stewart, John Stephen Semensky, James Edward Thompson, Delancey DeBerry Tolbert, John Carl Took, Richard Tremblay, Preston Harry Turner Jr., Edgar Henry Valenzo, Ralph Wensley Vaux, Lawrence Joseph Bergelow, Robert John Wade, Harry Edward Wagner, Walter Weiss, Charles Robert Wenzel, Justin Rice Whitting IV, Alexander Cole Jr., Gail Herbert Belver, John Turner Galvin Jr., John Charles Haynes Jr., Francis William Mack, Donald Francis McDowell, Peter Francis Meade, Peter Mongolardi Jr., John Richard Morvay, Eugene Lawrence Self, Joseph Lewis, John Simmons, George Dayton Adams, John K. Adams, George William Alexander, Joseph Archuleta, Gabriel Baca, William Clifford Bunyan Jr., Edward A. Cabra, Larry Paul Cambos, Robert F. Chamberlain, Alan Bradley Cipriani, Sam Cruz, John Randolph Simmons Jr., Joby Clayton Dozer, Harry Gordon Dyer, Antone Alvarodi Esquada, Daniel Ferdinand, Lone M. Fletcher, Lloyd Lee Gooding, Thornton A. Grifton Jr., Juan Federico Octaves Morte
Era, Edward Charles Begay, Freddie Isadora Branch, Jerry Harold Bryant, Stephen Michelle Carnahan, Anthony Mack Cass, Albert Allen Curley, Edward Earl Davies, Edward Daniel Davis, Jacob Henry Fountain, Kaufman, Joe Mack Kemp, Kent Allen Leonard, David Rie Malines, R.B. Marchbanks Jr., Alcido Norbert Marcinez, Victor H. Montoya, Joseph Michelle Moore, Francis Xavier Nava, James Sanders Oldham, Pedro Padilla, Sam Ivan Allenfoff, Israel Alicia, Manuel Alicia, Channing Hadley, William Martin Bradley, Lloyd Herbert Bray, William Robert Brennan, Emmanuel Chris Brickhouse, Edward Lee Brown, George Allen Brown, Burrell, Judge Bruto Jr., Peter B. Bushke, Ori Julius Bushke, Reuben Butcher, Robert Edward Butler, Thomas J. Butler Jr., John Richard Casiapo, Frederick Frank Cadillo, James Cambrelin, Salvatore Camarata, Roy Billy Kennedy, Harold Jeffrey Kanan, George Anthony Kanata, Vincent Jr. John Andrew Cardo, Farrell Richard Carew, Robert J. Comedy, Len E. Carr, Frederick James Caraturo, Bradley James Carson, Carmen Paul Cartonia, Paul William Casey, Juan Casiano, Donald Thomas Cassidy, Raymond Center Cassidy, James William Collier, Nathaniel Collins, Thomas Edward Collins, Walter Monroe Collins, Jean Francis Colvin, Martin James Conrad, Randall Vincent Cook, Joseph Henry Cooper Jr., Linwood Calvin Corbett, James Albert Corr, Richard P. Corson, David Paul Coveney, John R. Cowan, Horace W. Cowdrick Jr.
Teddy, how did the Moratorium Day project for October 15th specifically ever begin?
Well, nationally it began when April of last year, some interested people got together and decided that now was a time that maybe we could have a surge towards ending the war nationally that would show the administration of our government that there was a mass amount of people concerned about ending the war. And it came from a businessman who had been in the peace movement for various years, mentioned it to a 26-year-old ex-graduate of Harvard Divinity School, and they themselves formed a committee and finally hit upon, after postponing it each month, to the date of October 15th as a prime time.
How did it get to TCU?
We had heard some interested students who had been interested in the peace movement throughout the country had heard that this was going to happen, and we wanted to take the national idea of suspending classes or business as usual and going into the community and informing people about the war to here on this campus, Texas Christian University, to inform the people, to, in classes, through dialogue, debate, and discussion, make people aware of the issue, and also through reading of the names and symposium and a celebration of peace, make people aware through their consciences that a war was going on.
To what degree are you having success in maintaining the neither pro or con war, but simply the fact that the war is going on? To what degree are you successful in that effort?
I think that we've allowed options for both pro and con ideas on the war to come out. In class, I sat in on 3 classes today and spoke, and there's been people that have supported the war, which have said there's reasons why we can't just pull out rapidly, and this is being understood. There's also people which say we need to get out immediately, we made a gross mistake. And both these views are coming to the forefront, at least the possibility for them to be here and to be discussed and talked and dialogued back and forth are evident.
Okay, good. Do you consider yourself part of this demonstration?
No, I don't. I think the reason is that, in the first place, these people their ideas behind it are not going to do any good. They're just standing out here. They don't have any solutions. They're not doing anything constructive. I think if they want to do something constructive about this, about the war, then they ought to be directing a moratorium against Hanoi, Peking, and Moscow, who are the ones that are prolonging it, not the United States.
Do you feel that the move here is against the war, or is it against President Nixon's handling of the war?
I think when I've heard them, it's against war, period, in general. But I think it's going to backfire and be against Nixon's handling. And for that reason, I think they should make it plain where they stand, which I don't think they've done.
If, as you suggest, they took a moratorium against the communist nations, would you participate then?
Yes, I would.
Okay.
Explaining her discovery. And she returned home feeling that there was no victory, that it was all a defeat whenever men got themselves into this situation. Now, from those brief biographical facts, because you must understand people's ideas come from the experiences of their lives, or should come from them, and not simply be intellectual theories. From that brief description of her, I want to move into some ideas, if I may. And I want to talk about 3 works of literature, one of them written by herself, one by the Greek dramatist Sophocles, and one by the Greek historian Thucydides. And these 3 works, I think, will explain particularly the complexity rather than the simplification of the present situation. And I hope we may think of that past situation in terms of the present, that it may give us some purchase, as they say. When you're trying to climb a bank or something, you have to hang on to a root to get up it, onto the present situation. Let me begin with the play Antigone, which some of you may have seen, by Sophocles, in which the chief figure is a woman, Antigone, the sister of two brothers who have hated each other so much that they have killed each other in battle. One of them considered a patriot of the city, the other its enemy. And Antigone decides she must bury the body of her slain brother, even though he was an enemy of the city. He tried to take it over, of the society to which she belonged. And she is opposed by the rulers. And now let me go on from that to a history of a war by Thucydides, the Greek historian, the Peloponnesian War, in which Athens and Sparta were fighting, and Athens was ultimately destroyed. Now, in that history, there were several speeches that were very dear to Simone Weil and seemed to her to tell the truth. Let me mention two of them. One of them is by a demagogue, the political rabble-rouser named Cleon, whose business it is, in order to remain in power, to excite the political patriotism of the population. And he does so by continually arousing in them their bloody instincts, simply to destroy the enemy. In the course of doing so, though, he says some truths. He said, you know, we have an empire here, and people who have power are not liked, they are disliked. They create envy and fear in other people. And we must not assume that these people love us, or even like us, that they only remain under us because they are afraid of us. And when anyone revolts from us, or does something we don't like, the thing to do is to kill them, and make no bones about it. We cannot engage in thoughts about the soul, or goodness, or virtue, or that. What we must engage in as practical people is how to preserve our power. And he says something that's terrible, but I think true. If we do not behave with absolute strength, he says, the only alternative is to surrender your empire so that you can afford to go in for philanthropy. Now that's a mean remark. That philanthropy, or let us say charity, if we want to shift to a Christian term, and empire don't go together. You choose either the empire or you choose charity. I choose the empire. Now, in a later speech, a famous speech called the Melian Debate, the Athenians have descended upon a little city that wants to remain free, and they say they're going to take them. And the Melians say, but that's not just, that's not good. And the Athenians reply, but that's not what we're here for. It is a rule of human nature that the strong, the powerful, do what they have the power to do, and the weak accept what they must accept. Either you surrender to us or we will destroy you. The Melians even go so far as to say the gods wouldn't like that. God wouldn't like that. God, you know, is supposed to be for justice And the Athenians reply, what we know of the gods and what you know if you tell the truth, that in all cases, speaking of the Greek gods here, where they rule, they can, and no one surrenders his power voluntarily. It is against human nature. Now this is a very real problem. And in Simone Weil's view, which is contaminating, to her, power was ultimately and always contaminating of the human soul, that it produced dehumanization and brutality and violence, and there was no end to it. But the only way that the powerful can get out of this is by no means the way of safety. That weakness is always subject to being stomped on by those who are left with the power, and that we must make a decision about taking such risks, and that we must be willing to sacrifice ourselves, perhaps to lose all that we have. And she, being Christian, though she wasn't converted ever to official Christianity, it's really like the New Testament. When Christ says to the young rich man, if you want to get into heaven, you must give away all that you have. Now, these are hard commandments, and none of us really believe that. We would like to stay both powerful and good. That's the terrible psychological confusion in the United States. But it's not only a confusion of a government, it may be a confusion in an individual life. We would like to stay both rich and good. We want to have, you see, both things. We want to have our cake and eat it too. We would like to get out of the present war in a house built to honor the God he served. In New York City, in the Riverside Church, on April the 4th, 1960, an obvious interrelationship of the wastefulness of war and the delay of poverty programs in the United States. He said, there is at the outset a very obvious connection between the war in Vietnam and the struggle I and others have been waging in America. A few years ago, there was a shining moment in that struggle. It seemed as if there was a real promise of hope for the poor, both black and white, through the poverty program. There were experiments, hopes, new beginnings. Then came the buildup in Vietnam, and I watched the program broken as if it were some idle political plaything of a society gone mad on war. And I knew that America would never invest the necessary funds or energies in rehabilitation of its poor, so long as adventures like Vietnam continued to draw men and skills and money like some demoniacal, destructive suction tube. So I was increasingly compelled to see the war as an enemy of the poor and to attack it as such. In addition to this unyielding economic and political fact, as Dr. King interpreted, he also saw the sons, the brothers, and the husbands of the poor, black and white, dying in Vietnam at a disproportionate rate relative to the rest of the population. The war was doing far more than devastating the hopes of the poor at home. We were taking, he said, the black young men who had been crippled by our society and sending them 8,000 miles away to guarantee liberties in Southeast Asia, which they had not found in Southwest Georgia and East Harlem. So we've been repeatedly faced with the cruel irony of watching Negro and white boys on TV screens as they kill and die together for a nation that's been unable to seat them together in the same schools.
So we watched them in brutal solidarity, burning the huts of a poor village, but we realized that they would never live on the same block in Detroit. I could not be silent in the face of such cruel manipulation of the poor. Further, Dr. King maintained that he could not conscientiously protest the use of violence in solving the problems of American ghettos without also condemning violence in America. He said this, "I knew that I could never again raise my voice against the violence of the oppressed in the ghettos without having first spoken clearly to the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today, my own government." As a civil rights leader, Dr. King was not only committed to helping the Negro, he was committed also to the motto of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, to save the soul of America. And he said, "No one who has any concern for the integrity and life of America can ignore the present war. If America's soul becomes totally poisoned, part of the autopsy must read Vietnam." He recalled that he accepted the Nobel Peace Prize not merely as an honor for past services, but also as a commission to work harder than ever for the brotherhood of man. "This is a calling," he said, "that takes me beyond national allegiances. But even if it were not present, I would yet have to live with the meaning of my commitment to the ministry of Jesus Christ. The good news was meant for all men, for communist and capitalist, for their children and ours, for black and for white, for revolutionary and conservative. The Christian who takes the call of Jesus Christ seriously is bound by allegiances and loyalties which are broader and deeper than nationalism, and which go beyond our nation's self-defined goals and positions. We are called to speak for the weak, for the voiceless, for the victims of our nation and for those it calls enemy. For no document from human hand can make these humans any less our brothers." The apex of that address seemed to come in